My name is Rick O'Shea. I'm a broadcaster with RTE for the last almost 20 years now at this stage. I used to be a presenter on 2FM for about 17 of those. I'm on RTE Gold these days, and for the last 2 years, for my sins, I am now the presenter of the book show on RTE Radio 1 as well.
Yes, and before that, you kind of broadcaster in lots of different. You actually at an East Coast Radio in my old hometown for a while as well, weren't you? Back in the day.
I was 19. We're talking back in the day. The first job, yeah, it was the first job I ever had. I had no interest in radio. I know people for whom it's a vocation in life, and for whom when they were 12 years old, they were putting together their own, pirate radio stations in their back bedroom. I was far too lazy to do any of that. I was only interested in reading and playing computer games and watching telly. So I kind of fell into radio very accidentally. I was 15. There was a competition. There were a load of prizes. I thought, I'll have a go at that. It was the summer. I was off school. I remember it as being one of those long, hot Dublin summers. It was 1988. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. And maybe I've made that up as I go along. And you had to do stuff on the radio. So the first thing was you had to do like a phone call thing, and you got one link and you had to just introduce a song. And you could do anything you wanted. And so I was 15 and my brother would have been 13 at the time, and we wrote a script together. Thankfully, I do not remember it. We wrote something that involved me doing an impression of somebody and some stupid thing, and then I introduced the song. And you did that live on the radio, and that was your demo. And I got a phone call back from them a couple of weeks later going, "You're in the semi-finals." I'm a 15-year-old kid. I'm like, what? I wasn't expecting it to go any further than that. This was where I thought this was going to go. So I went out. I did the semi-final, which I think was about 15 minutes on the radio. This was out back in the day at the old Sunshine Radio out in Portmarnock. They had a couple of porta cabins behind the Sands Hotel in Portmarnock. The Sands Hotel, which became briefly very famous again quite recently in Normal People as being the venue for the Debs in Normal People. I was watching Normal People and I went, hang on, that looks a bit like the Sands in Portmarnock. And the shot flipped out to the sea and I went, that is the Sands in Portmarnock. I spent a bit of time around there, even though I'm not from the north side. But I did that, and then they brought me back for the final. And I'm like, what? This is a joke that's gone far too far. And I lost, which was great, because it would have been a terrible idea to give all those prizes to a 15-year-old kid. I wouldn't have known what to have done with them. But one of the guys who was there just said, would you ever think of doing some of this? And I was like, not really. So the year between doing my leaving cert and starting in UCD, I went into St. James's Hospital, which was the local hospital to where I was, that had a hospital radio station, and said, hello, I've never done any of this before. Can I do something, please? And, they were always interested in getting kids involved because, you didn't get anything for it and you turned up and you put in a load of work, and they taught you how to put a fader up and pull a fader down and do all of that. And I started in college, and it was the first year they had a student radio station in UCD. So again, I walked in the door and went, hello, I've no idea what to do. Can I join you? And luckily, I was surrounded by other people who'd never done it before either, because it was year one of their student radio station. Still runs today. They have permanent studios out there now and everything. My son was there a couple of years ago, and he did some shows there. But so I kind of fell into it. Right. And then I did a bit of that. And then I went to college and I was terrible. I failed my first year in UCD. I did a year of arts in UCD and I was awful in it. And I crashed and burned by the time I made it to the end of it. And by the time I made to the end of it, I kind of went, maybe I'd like to have a go at this radio thing. So I applied to what was then Senior College Ballymun and is now BCFE. And I went and did broadcasting and journalism in that, and I got a gig in local radio in East Coast, at the time filling in and doing a few bits and pieces at the weekend on a sports show, handing bits of paper to the guy who was doing the show going, here's all the latest scores from Division 1. And would it have been Premier? No, it would have been Premier League. It was post Premier League era. And then I fell into a job, and they offered me a job at the end of my year in Ballymun, and that was 19 whatever, so it was 91 to 93-ish. And I've been foolishly doing this as allegedly a job ever since then. And I'm now 47 and I still don't have a real job.
Come here to me, take me back. I mean, in relation to you're saying, having no interest in broadcasting or no interest in radio. Like when you were it was Drimnagh, wasn't it? Drimnagh and Crumlin kind of.
I was born in Drimnagh and grew up in Crumlin, yeah.
And so when you were a young man growing up, like you were saying, like reading and telly, was kind of the broader kind of cultural, was that very much voracious around your reading even at that age?
Yeah, I read a lot when I was a kid. I read a lot of comic books when I became a slightly older kid. I used to make the weekly trek into Easton's and O'Connell Street with my grandparents. They used to bring me in when I was like 9, 10, 11. And that was there. They brought me out for the day on a Saturday, me and my brother. And we'd go into Easton's and come back with either a stack of comics or a bunch of Three Investigators books or Hardy Boys or whatever I was reading at the time. And so that was part of what I did. I voraciously watched television. Like, it was the mid 1980s.
Yeah.
I mean, pop culture was television. It was all we had. And the radio was kind of on in the background. So I was kind of aware of music just as it went out on the radio. My dad played a lot of music in the house, although my dad was really into trap music and still is, and folk music. So, my dad wasn't exactly playing, Lou Reed in the background. And I stumbled on a load of stuff then through that, and then it all took root from there. And then once I used to go to the cinema, but you go see whatever was on. I go see Empire Strikes Back in 1980, and then by the time I was old enough, when I was 16, 17, and I started going to the movies myself, I found the old lighthouse on Middle Abbey Street, and then I became wildly interested in going to the movies as well, and it all kind of came from there.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because grew up in a similar era, and I think the effect of, you mentioned a couple of things there. The Three Investigator books, I probably have bits of the paper in my mouth. Probably still, I kind of ethnic so voraciously, but also the effect of watching the BBC or watching the English channels. I mean, there wasn't a huge amount of content, Irish content at all. An Irish drama was like a once in a 5-year turnaround. Yeah. Not even so many homegrown, even general programming. But so if I remember, around that time or before, like Swap Shop and the old Football Focus and all those, and you can watch hours and hours of the kind of wider cultural from across the water, and up against a time when culturally across the water was kind of a whole other space. It was always a real weird looking back at that time, that's kind of very Irish and yet very influenced by England.
And I suppose it depended on what was watched in the house as well, because as a kid, you had no control over either the dial or later the remote control. So you'd no control about what happened. And if your parents wanted to watch Glenroe, you watched Glenroe. Or if they wanted to watch That's Life, which was a bizarre weekly moment in our house, which was, essentially, for those people who never saw That's Life, it was people writing in letters, complaining about things, and Esther Ranson would read out the letters, and then they'd send people off to kind of sort out some of these things, and then comedy clips of dogs who could say words. And that was like high concept television in like 1982 or 83. And we watched a lot of comedies. So when you were saying, that kind of once in an era television thing, that might have been Leave It to Mrs. O'Brien, which was if you've never seen it, it's the precursor of Father Ted, except it's not as funny.
Yeah.
And there's a bit of, news was on in the house as well all the time as well. It's not like, and again, even with me and my kids now, we share a lot of common cultural hotspots, but we don't watch all the same stuff at the same time. Yeah. And they see things that, and in an entirely different time and place than I see them, and then we end up talking about them. But in those days, you had 3 channels you watched until Channel 4 came along in the 80s, and then you could watch Countdown, and that was brilliant. I loved Countdown. And 15 to 1. I developed my quiz obsession from watching 15 to 1 when it started on Channel 4 in whatever it was, 83 or 84 when Channel 4 started, because that was, you just come home from school, bit of Countdown, bit of 15 to 1.
And did you kind of really feel kind of that, you hit on quizzes, and that was kind of something that was going to, open up a whole new side of your brain?
Oh yeah, this is my other great obsession in life is quiz shows. I got so obsessed with Countdown, or for Countdown was okay, but that was a part of my brain I wasn't necessarily great at. Shuffling of letters and finding words was complicated. Remembering things I was all right at. Mm-hmm. So when 15 to 1 came along, I got so obsessed with it that when I was 17, so it would have been 1990, I got the train up to Belfast one December in the absolute freezing cold. It was snowing. And I turned up in Belfast to audition for 15 to 1 because they didn't do them in Dublin because officially, it was a UK TV show, but you were allowed to come up if you were from Dublin. And I auditioned in front of the late William G. Stewart in a freezing hall somewhere near the main train station in Belfast in about 1990. And I was miserable. I was awful. And I lasted about 10 seconds in the audition, and that was it. I went home. But this is my lifelong obsession with quiz shows, and I do. My Monday night is now Mastermind, Only Connect, University Challenge, and that's the height of my year. I've spent most of lockdown, along with my wife, sitting in next door watching old episodes of University Challenge on YouTube, because it's my chewing gum brain telly that means I don't have to think about anything else.
That's great. So you have to remind me of something that used to really annoy me as a kid was kind of the UK Irish thing. The competitions on comics, you could very rarely enter them because on the back it was like, open to UK, but not era or whatever they kind of chose to call it. It was fascinating kind of thinking back on that stuff now. I have visions of your rig kind of sitting in a starstruck community hall somewhere in Belfast, having your life's hopes dashed at a very early age.
It ruined it for me up until a point, and I spent all of the rest of my adult life then watching quiz shows. And then in 2012, when TV3 bought the rights for one series of Mastermind, which they only ever put out one, Nora Owen was the presenter in 2012, and it was, quote, and I use this word lightly, celebrity Mastermind. And I begged TV3 publicly on social media to let me play. I had to go and ask my bosses because obviously it was on a different channel. And they went, all right, if they let you in, go on, you can go and play it. And I played the only tournament of Mastermind ever on Irish TV, and I won it, and I still have the trophy next door, and I'm undefeated champion forever because they're never going to run another one again, and I have my big piece of crystal next door. And so that kind of made up for not being on 15 to 1 when I was a 17-year-old kid, a little bit.
And what was your specialist subject on Mastermind?
You had to do again a semi-final and a final. So I did the semi-final was the films of Woody Allen, and the final was the solar system. I decided I'll pick two things I know stuff about. I know a load about old Woody Allen films. I didn't pick anything book related because I didn't want to, you don't want to fail miserably at something you love that much.
Yeah.
And I've been an astronomy nut since I was a kid as well, so I thought that might be fun to do, and it was great. And it's been the highlight of my life, and it's been downhill from there the last 8 years.
Goodbye.
And that's it. It's been a pleasure. Good luck now. Bye.
Come here to me. Did you know? Like when you say you kind of like through school, what like did you like school? Was there a graphy in relation to school, or was it like not for me? It was just normal.
I was fine. I was the worst of those kind of kids, and I see it sometimes in my own kids, which is I could coast and get away with it. So I never had the work ethic that there were lads in my class who, and I went to a Christian Brothers school in Drimna. There were lads in my class, in the higher class, who I knew they were seriously putting all the work and all the effort in, and they were brilliant at this kind of stuff. I coasted. I did the minimum amount of effort. When it came to my leaving cert, I looked at all the papers from the previous 5 years, and I played the odds. It worked out okay in some and not so okay in others. And to be honest with you, it didn't get me what I wanted. Like, I would have loved to have gone on and done, my first choice was communications in DCU, which I didn't have the points for. And that's why I kind of fell into doing other stuff. But did I enjoy it? I enjoyed bits of it. There were other bits of it I didn't. I was terrible at PE. I was awful. I had no eye-hand coordination when it came to sports at all. I was enthusiastic, but I was terrible. And I came from a school that had a very big tradition of Gaelic football and hurling, and they kind of tended to do well and that kind of stuff. But was I any? I don't know. And there's always that element of looking back at yourself and going, well, I remember what I was like when I was 7 years old. And I don't remember any of that. I was probably a bit of a teacher's pet, and I was probably a bit of a lick. And I was probably the sort of kid who volunteered to do stuff because it got me out of class for 10 minutes.
Yeah. And when you say about communications, was there a kind of a career in your head, or was it just that was an area you were broadly interested in?
Yeah, no, it was just something I was interested in. I had no sense that I was going to end up doing something with the rest of my life, and I still don't. I certainly at that stage when I left school, I was good at accounting. I probably could have become an accountant, and I probably would regret that to this day because I would have just driven me demented. Bless accountants; they're important, they're needed, they're fantastic at their jobs. I don't have the ability or the. Other than that was it. And I knew nothing about anything. And I thought, well, this has got a bit of telly, a bit of radio, a bit of journalism, there's other stuff in that. They might let us do a bit of film as well. It seemed like a really good idea at the time, but I failed miserably and didn't get in there and settled for a good arts degree.
Well, hey, we've all been there. I had a good arts degree as well.
Yeah, yeah.
You mentioned Celebrity Mastermind, but that was to do with causes as well. That obviously, wasn't you representing like for Epilepsy Ireland.
Yeah.
And it was around that time when kind of, presume 4th, 5th to 6th year in school that became an issue for you. Was it a sudden thing, Rick?
Yeah, it was so sudden that, and I'm apologies if anybody's heard me tell this story before, but I was 16. It was Christmas, and I gave my parents the best Christmas present of all time. I keeled over and took the Christmas tree with me and collapsed and ended up in an ambulance. That was the first seizure I had. None of us in the family had any real concept of what epilepsy was or was about. You kind of sort of know it involved someone falling over and wriggling around on the ground, and we'd nothing beyond that.
Yeah.
There was certainly no one in my school who had it. We didn't know anybody, no one in the family. And yeah, it happened really quickly. And then I had another one kind of relatively soon after that as well, and they diagnosed you fairly quickly. And so, yeah, I've had it for the last 31 years and counting.
And how, just for say for those who don't know, like how difficult is that to kind of manage? I suppose when it kind of began for you and as you grew up, like has that been a major factor in your life, or is it something that it's just part of you?
I've been incredibly lucky. When you ask how people manage it, it is literally one of those conditions that is managed entirely differently, person by person by person. So my experience is completely different than that of somebody who sits beside me or somebody beside them as well. I've been on medication since I was 16 years old, and I do it, take 4 pills a day. I'm lucky enough that the last time I had a seizure was 2010, 10 years ago. But if I were to stop taking the medication that I'm on, I'd probably have one in the space of 36 hours. I went through big chunks of my adult life where I was on medication and I wasn't. And then I went through phases where I'd just have a seizure randomly out of nowhere, and I'd have one 6 months later or 18 months later. There's always the possibility that it can happen at any time and in any place, and particularly if you do something like forget a couple of sets of pills, which is why I never forget a couple of sets of pills. But has it? So for some people, it absolutely alters the trajectory of their life completely.
Yeah,
I have been so lucky in that I don't think it has. I don't think it has altered my career choices. I certainly have never come across bosses who have said, "Oh, well, I don't think we're going to let you do this because you have epilepsy." I've got a nice bunch of people that I've worked with over the years, but it does work differently for other people. Absolutely.
And it's something you've chosen to kind of become involved in and advocate for, over many, many years. And I could come back to that in a minute, but I suppose what I'm interested in is that moment of when you say you kind of fell in love with radio or kind of something. Was that it? Was that a sudden thing, or was it kind of slow? Like, was there a moment you kind of smelt it and went, "Oh, this is"?
With radio, I think it's the more people tell you you're not that bad at this, the more you go, "Oh, yeah." Everybody likes positive affirmation, and everybody likes somebody to say to them, "You're not half bad at that, are you?" And so I think that's what happened. And I think with me, it was being in hospital radio in James's was just a way of learning how things worked. And I was playing to an audience of pretty much zero. They weren't on FM. They were on speakers around the hospital, most of which were turned off at any one time. So it's fine. I had no audience, but it's a great way to learn how to completely screw up stuff to begin with. And then when I get into college, yeah, I enjoyed doing so. I did, I played music shows, but I did, the first year I was there, the societies show. So I went out with a microphone and interviewed people from societies and said, "So why should we join your society? What about the kayaking club?" And that was fun because I got to edit that stuff together and learn how to do all that. And you do a bit more of it and you go, this is nice. And I like music, and I like telling other people what sort of music I like. And I like seeing whether or not they like my music as well. Yeah. And so then by the time you get into radio and somebody says, "We're going to pay you next to nothing if you want to come and work 6 nights a week for us," you go, "Absolutely. How little are you paying me? Brilliant."
Yeah, because I remember, the friends of mine were involved even before East Coast, like in BLB it was called back in the area. But like there's a radio crew in Ireland that kind of, grew out of, that's the next generation on from, say, like of Dave Fanning and Mark Cagney were kind of seeing what was possible and kind of getting influenced by Radio Caroline. All of, but then we're kind of, really local radio became a hotbed, particularly in the certain slots of kind of people playing all sorts of stuff. and as you say, playing your music and seeing do other people like it. And then I suppose what's interesting then, what's interesting to me is when you move them forward into more commercial or state funded land, and kind of, so that you obviously were a fella who kind of learned how to do it all, learned how to do, and then suddenly you have people who are going to do that for you. Do you know what I mean? You kind of go, oh, okay, I'm not in charge of that anymore.
Yeah, there's a bit of, well, there's an element of, you see, and it's always whenever you're in the likes of a student radio station or a hospital radio station, but pretty much mostly, you have freedom over what you play and what you do, which is brilliant, and it's amazing, and it's a great freedom. Obviously, when you've got somebody who owns a big company that advertisers pay money to be on, they're not going to let you just turn up and play whatever the hell you feel like, or pretty much they're not going to allow that. So certainly when I started in Atlantic 252, from there on, and the first, like when I was on East Coast and I was on Southeast Radio after that, I was on late at night. Like I was on between 10 and 1 in the morning, or I think one of them was 11 and 2. So I was on at a point where I could do very little damage, even if I wanted to. Okay. By the time I ended up on Atlantic, and I was doing bits and pieces there, and then I ended up on daytimes, and then I was brought into 104 in Dublin. You do as you're told. There is a playlist. It comes out. It's on a sheet of paper. You play this, and this. Now, what goes between that? That's up to you. The bit where that's what you're being paid for is the chat. And then RTE though is a different entity again, because certainly from the time I started in 2FM and I started again on nights, I had complete freedom over my first set of playlists when I was on nighttime 2FM. Again, I was on between 11 and midnight. It was, you were okay. But all of the nighttime presenters in 2FM did. And this is around the time when Tony Fenton was still doing the hotline, Dave Fanning was on nights. So people had that freedom to play and do whatever it was that they felt like, certainly on night times. When I went to daytimes on 2FM, you had a huge input into your own playlist, because one of the beliefs that ran down through 2FM for all the time I was there, and certainly up until about 6 or 7 years ago, was that, the presenter was part of what people bought into, and they bought into your taste in music. You didn't get to play everything, but you would get to throw in stuff that people knew you were passionate about if you're on in the middle of the day. Then you get to the stage where I'm on RTE Gold now, and I can do anything I want. Every morning I go in and go, where are we starting today? And I can play any song pretty much from the 1930s all the way up until about 2010, and I do. I go in of a morning and I look through. There is a playlist that comes out. It's all generated. And if you wanted to, I could do nothing. And instead I go, nah, don't like that. Don't like the look of this. No more Snow Patrol. Good luck. And I just stick in David Bowie, and I stick in, Kate Bush, and I stick in whatever I fancy. So, it is swings and roundabouts, and it depends on where you are, and it depends on who you are. And it certainly depends on, when you're somebody who's been picking music playlists for radio, as I have, forever. I say picking a music playlist. You just pick songs that you like, stuff that you think sounds great. You're given a bit more latitude, because, my boss knows I'm not going to come in and go off on one day and turn it into the opera hour. They know that's not going to happen, mostly.
Until tomorrow.
And who knows? Yeah. And it's one of the joys of working where I work right now.
Yeah. Come here to me. The bit in between you're talking about is like, has that, you're talking in hospitals about kind of, talking to yourself or kind of training yourself into ways of communicating with people. But obviously as things grow, you're quite obviously talking to people. And has there ever been a situation where, not so much stage fright, but that kind of sense of kind of going, okay, because it's live and you have to formulate what you're going to say, but how much do you like being in response to what's coming in at you, or not? I don't mean scripted, but like, have a kind of narrative that you want to drive yourself.
I think it's strange. My wife is a solicitor, and every now and then, very rarely, she will have to give a talk to like a group of people in her office, or she'll have to give a talk to like an insurance company that they work for, and it terrifies her beyond all mortal belief. She has witnessed me on more than one occasion go into an event of some kind, and she'll say, are you sure what you're going to say? You know what you're going to do right now? And I'll go, it has to be about 12 minutes long. It's going to be this thing. That's going to be fine. I'll put it all together. It'll be okay. I think from doing live radio for as long as you do it, if you manage to do it and do it well and do it decently, you end up developing like a gene. There's part of you in here that then allows you to talk constantly as I am in this situation now. And if you were to leave me alone, I could talk on this for about 15 minutes without necessarily having to actually engage anything of what's going on up here. So, but I think it depends in terms of your question as to how old you are.
Okay.
Because when I was 19, when I started doing the first show I ever did was like a late night love song show at a point in which I knew nothing about love and very little about late nights. But I was 19 and I was going, hey, here's some more jazz, whatever. It wasn't quite that, but it was, I was playing 70s disco. And that's different from then when I was on Atlantic, when I was 20, 21, 22, where your links were 7 seconds long and all you were allowed was, hey, here's the station. And then the older you get and the more you kind of can just grow into who you are. I've listened to tapes of me when I was 20, 21. I don't know who that kid is. I have no idea who he is. You get to the stage, hopefully, the further along you go, the more you become you. And the more, when I stick up a microphone in the morning, I am absolutely pretty much me. I used to joke about how there were two personalities, that there was the guy who worked on the radio and I took him out of a box like he was here and used him and then put him away and I'd come home. But the two things have kind of merged into each other over the space of doing this for as long as you've done it. So that now, and in particularly when you end up doing speech radio, so doing stuff like the poetry program and the book show and doing Shelf Analysis, the series I've been doing online, in terms of talking to authors like this in a two-hander situation for a very long period of time, unless you're you and unless you're capable of having those conversations at length without a certain amount of prep, but without knowing that you're not going to go dry at any point, pretty much. I'm looking at you. I'm absolutely sure you are not going to go dry at any point in this conversation. And I'm sure I wouldn't in a given situation doing that as well. But as to how you do that, it's like anything else, I suppose. It's practice, isn't it? It's the more you do it, the more you feel comfortable doing it, and therefore.
Yeah, but thanks for putting dryness on the table now, Rick. That's great.
Sorry, apologies. You're not feeling dry, are you, by any chance?
I'm going to take a cup of coffee now. In around that, then you presented. I mean, you went to FM, and very very quickly were very successful. It wasn't only within a year you were nominated for Meteor Awards, and that. So,
God, do you remember the Meteor Awards? Remember when they were a thing? Back in the day.
I just wanted to say it. I just remember hearing that so much. It's great. But I mean, I suppose again that's moving into a whole different machine into RTE, and I think, but also, from then to here, you've kind of lived through a time when the media, and particularly the kind of spoken word media or the music media, has changed like no one could have ever guessed it was going to change. But I suppose back then, also RTE had, as you mentioned earlier on, like Tony Fenton and Dave Fanning were still, at the height of their powers in what they were doing, have been doing for kind of years. And there's a sense that there was kind of continually new ground being broken. It must be very exciting to be kind of part of that as a young man.
It was exciting to be offered a job, let's be honest. I mean, come on, by the time I was, and it's a true story, I've only ever been out of work for 6 months in my entire adult life. Fingers crossed, touch wood, that doesn't happen to me tomorrow. But I got fired from 104 back in whatever, the beginning of 2000. They'd had enough of me, and something had changed, and they were going in a different direction, and the same thing that people get told. And I was out of work, so I was scrambling around looking for a job for 6 months. I had a 2-year-old son who was almost about to turn 3. So there were proper bills to be paid, and there was serious considerations at the time. So yeah, when 2FM came along, firstly, there's that element of, oh, this is RTE, this is very exciting, this is going to be a big move in my career. But basically it was, I'm going to be able to pay the rent this month. That was the key and important thing when it came to getting in there. It's weird because I've thought about this more than once. Like, I was 28 when I started. I was, in terms of all the presenters in 2FM when I was there, I was the young lad, because you're right, it still was a daytime schedule that Ian Dempsey had just left to go to what is now Today FM, and Tony Fenton was there. Barry Lang, I think, was still there. Gareth O'Callaghan was certainly still there. So I was a young lad when I turned up on the schedule. And the other day, somebody sent me a questionnaire thing for an interview I was doing, and they referred to me as a veteran broadcaster. And it's that moment where you go, that's it, done, good luck, cheers, thanks very much. And And what happens is frequently as well, when you do that thing where you do the long form talking, I forget what the question was that you asked me, and I've just gone off on a complete left one. I have, absolutely, I have.
Banisters are still being held, but fingertips, but just you're still there. You've answered in relation to the fact of it being exciting going in, but also the fact that you're on, weekday afternoon show for a long, long time, and that puts you very much interface with a lot of the public. Do you know what I mean? Like, kind of, it's not just playing music late at night. The public expect a certain type of interaction with DJs, or hosts in the afternoon.
They did, and they do. And I mean, I was on afternoons in one form or another. Certainly before I went to weekends, before they eventually, kicked me off the edge of the earth completely. Bless them, love them, but it was right. I was too old to be playing pop music to kids. I was on with Cormac Battle, and Cormac and I would do afternoons, and I was lucky enough to be doing a show that was mostly music based. But I had a mate of mine with me who was doing other bits and pieces on the show. And we did extraordinary nonsense that makes no sense whatsoever right now, looking back at all of it. And maybe it's why they got rid of me. We did strange competitions that were these in-jokes that only existed between the two of us. But the thing is, there's always people who will buy into this. So when you say in terms of interfacing with audience, there's always a section of the audience that isn't really being played to. So whenever I talk to kids who are becoming presenters or thinking about becoming presenters in media societies or that kind of thing, the worst thing you can possibly do is go out there and pretend to be what you think the audience wants to hear. What you need to be is who you are, and then an audience will find you, fingers crossed, hopefully, because people can smell authenticity. Hopefully they can smell that this is roughly the sort of person who you are, as opposed to coming on and being, and everybody knows people who are like that as presenters. Ultimately, they don't last very long if you come in being the guy that you think you need to be, the guy on the radio who's this guy who does the stuff. Hey, that's no one wants that, and certainly doesn't work in 2020.
No.
And if the advance of social media has taught us anything, and obviously social media and radio now go hand in hand, it's that what people want is they want a certain level of authenticity from the people they engage with, whether it's people that they follow on social media or whether it's people that they either pay attention to on radio or in situations like this. At least I hope that's the truth.
Yeah.
And again, this all kind of ties back to, I started in RTE in 2001. RTE had only just gotten a proper website in 2001, and we were behind the times. It was just no one had websites in 2001. So the arc of my time there is inextricably linked with the arc of the internet becoming what it is in everybody's life right now.
Yeah, and I suppose to flip forward and flip back, I mean, you look at kind of where you're at now, and particularly during lockdown, and with the online, with the book club, and with there's and I suppose to talk about that, you have to kind of move, say, beyond kind of. I think I was reading about you last night, winning sexiest voice on radio at some stage during those healthy, and you must have.
I've tried to get that removed from my Wikipedia page over the years. I really have, and I can't. There's nothing I can do about it. It's just
you shouldn't. You should own it, and it's probably the trophy's probably beside the Mastermind ones. Stop lying about it.
It's a paperweight somewhere in the house. I'm not sure where.
But I suppose then, as you said, things changed for you radically in the mid 2010s. When I suppose a huge part of your life, from talking to you now and from knowing of you, came flying in. Like literature, books, culture, which was obviously a part of your life all the way along. But in relation to your professional life, your life took a kind of a sharp right or a sharp left, depending on which way you want to look at it. Was that kind of like, I won't say traumatic, but I mean, kind of, was that a bit of a, okay?
No, it was anti-traumatic. It was great. I finally got to talk about stuff I really loved as part of my job. Because prior to that, my job was to play pop music. And that's what I'd always done up until 2012, 2013, 2014. And all of the other stuff that I liked doing in life, so whether it was watching movies or whether it was reading or whether it was any of the other cultural pursuits that I took on, for instance, I had no space to talk about any of that. Now, the internet allows you that space. And weirdly, there's kind of two things that happened at the same time. And one of which was, when you have social media and where people are kind of paying attention to you, you can go, I just did this thing last night. I was just at this production last night. This thing happened. It's probably something you really should think about. But whereas I wouldn't have the space to talk about that on the radio show I was playing, because 2FM in the middle of the afternoon isn't where you talk about what's happening this week in the Dublin Theatre Festival that that you're looking forward to, because those things don't go together. So whatever it was, 2014, I started talking about books. I very quickly, in 25 words or less, decided I was going to read 100 books that year, because I'd always read, and I'd always read what I thought was fairly voraciously, and I'd kind of ground to a halt by the time I was in my mid-30s. I'd probably read like maybe 15, 16, 17, 18, 20 books a year, maybe. And I kept having that looking in the shelves every time I went into a bookshop and getting palpitations, because there were so many new things out I'd really like to read. And sure, where am I going to find the time to do that? So I thought, if I read 100 books in a year, it's 2 books a week. It's not impossible. You find the space. It's not as if, you work down the mines 18 hours a day. You don't. You'll find the space to do it. And I said it publicly, because I thought, unless I say this publicly, in 3 weeks' time, I'm going to go, it's a lot of hassle. So I said it, and I wrote a blog post about it at the time. I had a blog, and I wrote about it on social media. And what I didn't expect to happen was what happened, which was I was asked to go on radio to talk about this, as if I had suggested I was going to climb the 5 highest peaks on earth. I was only reading 100 books a year. It's not that impossible. And I went on Arena, I think, to do a thing. I wrote a column for the Indo about it. And I was kind of like, if I'd known you'd let me talk about this stuff all along, I would have been doing this years ago. And then one thing leads to another, and you start a little book club, and then people ask you to do, I've been interviewing people for the length of my professional career, but it was almost always bands or actors, usually. If you got very lucky, you get a film junket, and you get to go to London to interview Jason Isaacs. Hello to Jason Isaacs. But for me, I was then being asked to potentially consider doing book-related ones. And I was like, this is great, yeah. And then I started doing a couple of public audiences and interviewing authors in public. And now, if you flash forward 5 odd years later, that's about 75% of my job is either reading books for the purposes of work. I present a book show on Radio 1. I run a book club full time. I do recommendations 4 times a year for Easons with my friend Sinead Moriarty. I judge book prizes, and it's now become like it's what used to be my hobby, and what used to be that other part of my life has now become the thing that I do for fun. And apparently, people throw me a few quid to do it at the same time, which is always very helpful.
And but bring that back into something you said earlier on about, say, the interface between this ricochet and that ricochet, and kind of the authenticity of just being yourself. But I mean, you are hugely active in all these different spaces, and therefore hugely approachable in all these different spaces, and that must be extraordinarily difficult to manage. In relation to, I mean, it's one thing. I suppose it's one thing, kind of, being on a radio show and hosting it, whether it's hundreds of thousands, whatever it is. But there's a kind of, you're in a booth, and you're kind of, there's someone answering the phone, and there's someone, in the old days, there's someone, whatever, opening the post. But on your Twitter,
these days, I'm sorry, can I point out? These days, it's me in a darkened room by myself. That's it. That's the whole radio show.
Yeah. That's what I'm saying. So as things have kind of grown, they've shrunk as well, and that kind of, as readerships grow, and as radio reach grows, or as digital radio reach grows, or as online reach grows, you become more vulnerable, is the wrong word, but more exposed potentially in relation to having to kind of have that interface with an audience.
That's great. That's fantastic. But I suppose you go from a point though where, and it's weird. When I started in radio was strictly a one-way medium. So it was some guy, usually a guy, because again, the vast majority of jobs in radio at that point were with men, sitting in front of a microphone who talks, and then everybody listens on the other end. If you really, really wanted to, and it was local radio, you could try phoning them, maybe, and maybe somebody would answer the phone. If it was RTE, you could write a letter or a postcard. You could send Gaiman a postcard, and maybe he would get your postcard and read it out. You get to the point where presenters have email addresses, and that makes it obviously slightly more. And I think I had an email address when I was in 104, maybe in 96 or 97. I think I had an email address. And then the more quickly that moves on, and when social media platforms become a thing, I think I enjoyed the interactivity of that immensely, because sometimes, particularly when you're doing nighttime radio, it can be quite isolating. It can be just you. Even when I started, the first few years I was in RTE, it was just me in the building by myself, and whoever was on before me and whoever was on after me. There's no sense of a bustling workplace. But then social media kind of changes the rules because people can contact you immediately and you can contact them back. They can ask you a question about something and you can go, well, it's not that, it's this. And that was interesting in the Bebo MySpace. I had both accounts, working them on radio shows back in the day, and early Facebook phase. And then something like Twitter comes along, and I was introduced to Twitter by a friend of mine, a tech friend of mine, who said, you've got to try this thing. And I started using it on the radio show. My then boss, I had to ask him his permission. Can I use Twitter to talk to people on my radio show? He was like, why? Was his initial response. And then his other response was, as long as it's not going to cause any problems with me, off you go. So I was the first Irish radio show to use Twitter as like a back channel of communication to the presenter. And we can see how that all went. But it then creates an entirely, if you want to, it creates that dynamic. There's everything from, let's say, Ryan Tuberty, who doesn't do that. Ryan has an Instagram account for which he doesn't follow anybody and he just broadcasts. So it's just a broadcast medium. All the way down to those of us who, I'm on Twitter for the 3 hours of my radio show every morning. People ask stuff, they comment, I talk back, and it's literally a two-way conversation if it needs to be. I think for some people, they might feel that that's an intrusion or that's vulnerable, and you can't always just put that at arm's length. For me, it's actually one of the genuine joys of getting to do this is not just talking into the distance or the dark, but getting responses back in return. They're not always the best responses. They're not always the responses you want, but you have to live with that.
Yeah. But you seem also to be able to manage it and kind of stepping away. It's like, I think the difficulty in the arts, say, particularly, is that it becomes, a lot of people's way of interacting with peers, with kind of, whatever. And sometimes, and then work-life balance gets blurred. I mean, you kind of go, okay, why am I, even found it myself, like, why are you, answering a Facebook message about hiring the theater at 10 o'clock at night time? You're kind of going, so there's that approachability, but you seem to be very, very good at kind of, I suppose you have to be, to compartmentalize it as well.
The key word is work-life balance. And part of the problem is for most people, social media isn't work. Social media is part of who they are. It is part of their life box as opposed to being part of the work box. I'm not as great as I was prior to the pandemic, weirdly. I was always very religious about it. So while I was always on, when I was sitting at my desk in work during the day, it would always be there in the background. I'd be doing other stuff and you check in every now and then, you do all of that. When I came home, it was gone. So I didn't do stuff at night or at home. And certainly at weekends, zero chance of getting in contact with me on any of those. Now that I don't have a desk anymore, and I don't have a desk anymore, because almost everybody who works in the radio building in RTE are working remotely and from home. I'm not. I still go into the studio every day, but we're not encouraged to go up and sit at our desk. To be honest with you, there's no reason to, because there's nobody else up there to talk to apart from two or three other people. So that means I'm only really on social for a couple of hours every morning. So I do find myself checking in, and particularly with projects that are mine. So if it's something that I have a very vested interest in, and something I'm running, something I'm pushing, like you'll know this yourself. When you do something like this, like I do shelf analysis, and I'm running a book festival at Christmas, an online book festival for the crack and for free through an insanity of my own. But all of those are my own projects. So I have to, get graphics done up for them. And I'm the one who has to do all the social for them. And I do all the social for the book show and Radio 1 as well. So the line blurs, but I think you've got to be really, really careful. That you're right. It's that instinct to, just before you go to bed, go, I'll have a quick look at my emails. Somebody was looking for me about, and 25 minutes later, it's 11 o'clock at night and you're still answering something that would have waited until 8:30 tomorrow morning. I've no advice on that. And part of the problem is with something like Twitter, you're right. Some of the best connections I've ever made in the sphere of arts has been through social media, whether it's authors whose work I love, or whether it's people just who I respect in any field, whether it's music or whether it's film or whether it's theater. You manage to just make small connections with some of those people. And that's the sort of thing that none of us would ever have been able to have done without the nature of social media and how it works. So for me, I take all the bad stuff that there is involved in it, and there's some. I don't get a lot of abuse the way other people do. I don't express a lot of opinions. So, but I'm more than willing to take all of the really good stuff, all of the interaction stuff where I've met so many fantastic people, and put that in the good box. And then you have to add to that I have whatever 64 odd thousand followers. So I can take stuff that I love and things that I've gone to see or exhibitions I've been to and go, have a look at this. This is great. You might enjoy this. This might, and I can kind of repay the love for that in some sort of larger scale, because I don't really get to do it on Radio Shive on the book show and Radio 1 for Books.
Yeah. Interestingly, you know, there's you know, when you're talking about social media, I mean, I was remarking to someone last night actually, only that, you know, when this pandemic goes, you know, I think there'll be a lot of people, myself included, who have made new connections across this pandemic time. Like arriving out of a darkened room and kind of going, okay, do I know that person now? Or what? There'll be all these strange kind of copies happening in first aid land in the real world in Dublin over the summer of 2021.
I hope so. And I hope that everything that has happened to all of us now, and again, I suppose my personal experience from this is only really in the sphere of book festivals.
Yeah.
Because normally I would have spent my 2021 doing festivals across the summer, being around the country, you know, being in places like Listowel, or being in places like Neenah or Westport, or, you know, all the places I would normally end up doing those. None of those happened this year. I did some stuff online, a couple of bits and pieces, but obviously for festivals, you've got to be able to make it work financially so that you're not losing money. If you can make some money out of it, and to be fair, some did. Like Courage was the first festival this year that I'd been booked to go and do stuff at, and it happened very early on that Courage had to cancel. And Sacha DeBuil in Courage, who's just taken over the new gig, said, I'm not going to let this stop me, and then managed to put together, admittedly a trimmed down, but a series of events, and make sure the people who were working for her got paid, and managed to, you know, price it correctly so that people would, you know, pay a little here, just to make sure that things ticked over for another year. But the interesting conversation that was had with me by more than one person was people who would never normally get to go to, for instance, events like that, so book events. So people who, for various reasons, let's say they have restricted mobility, or people who can't get babysitting, or people who simply don't have the ability to travel from one side of the country to the other, but there's an author they love and somebody they'd really love to see, but that's never going to happen. Maybe when we all get back to what, you know, some laughing sense of normality, whenever that's going to be, that festivals will look at incorporating online streams into that, and therefore you will have people in the room, but either at the same time for a small fee, or at a later date, people will then get to watch those events with people that they would love to hear. I think the later date thing is it's kind of strange, because the ones I've seen that have worked really well are those that are done live, so where everybody is all watching at the same time, and there's some communal sense of and that's in terms of any arts events that I've been looking at. If there's some sense of that something is happening at 7 o'clock on a Thursday evening, and people are kind of tweeting about it, and it develops a kind of loose sense of camaraderie around those kind of events. And if festivals can hang on to that going forward, it's a way of opening out your audience as well as serving the audience that would normally have been there.
I could really, because in the last five years, you mentioned the festivals there, but as well as the broadcasting on the radio and the book club, which we'll talk about in a minute, but do you have, you know, you're hugely recognizable and lauded as an interviewer of authors and people around the books world at festivals, and now through your own shelf analysis. But is that something that you, I suppose, kind of a trite question in a way, but you must really be interested in those people. You know what I mean? I think you mentioned authenticity, so it's not so much liking people, but having that interest in what that person is really like. I
think that it's a scale. I think I love interviewing people in a room with an audience. I think there are things you get from that you will never, if you've only ever interviewed somebody face to face for a newspaper, or for in a situation like this where it's just you and I talking. When you're in a room with 20 people or 50 people or 1,500 people interviewing someone sitting on a stage, there is a buzz that comes from that kind of you have to say performance, because it is both for you and the author. There's a buzz that I get off that I miss immensely. My last public event of this year was with the photographer Martin Parr up in the Seamus Heaney home place. I interviewed him at the very beginning of March, and that's the last time I sat with someone in the arts world in a room of other people, and I miss it immensely. I am bereft because it's how I spend my year doing that. Now the question is, there are some people who I really want to talk to, and I've curated festivals before and deliberately given myself the interviews that I wanted to do, because you pick the people you want to talk to. And there are some gigs that you will take because you love the festival and you'll go, well, I don't know anything about this person, but yeah, okay, let's wait and see how this pans out. And there are some gigs you will take because you like the people that you're working for as well. I think sometimes all of those things combine, and you're in a place you want to be, working for people you like, and you're interviewing someone who you're totally fascinated about. There are gigs that I've bitten hands off for, and I've crawled over other people to get. I've interviewed Michael Chabon, and I've interviewed. I did 2 events with, and you know, it's interesting. I did 2 events last year, year before last, with Graham Norton when his second book was out. And it was less getting to talk to Graham Norton because I'd interviewed him before publicly, but the 2 events, one was in the Helix and one was in the Opera House in Cork on 2 consecutive nights, sold out on both nights. So you're essentially getting to just rub a little bit off the star, you know, ability of the person next to you. And I've interviewed Anne Enright publicly a couple of times as well. There are those people for whom you would, you know, crawl over broken glass to get to interview.
And you mentioned Graham there, just in relation to, you know, obviously fantastic author, but he knows the ropes of being on the far side of the table as well. So that must have been a very interesting, you know, dynamic going into that. Is he able to stop?
I have, well, again, and the thing is, as an interviewer, and whenever I'm doing this publicly, and you do the same thing here as well, is you don't interject all the time. You sit back and let the person who's being interviewed be interviewed. And that's the way I've done it my entire life. I only feel comfortable if I've got all the right questions, and I've got 9 correct questions that'll get me through 45 minutes, and I just keep nudging the person in front of me to talk the way that they want to talk. The more I disappear into the background as an interviewer, I'm fine with that. That makes me happy and comfortable. I remember watching Michael Parkinson on telly years ago, and there were times where he would almost disappear into the background. You were going, how do you manage this? Because he got the most incredible interviews out of the people that he spoke to. Now, the first time I interviewed Graham, I've done him, I think, about 4 times now at this stage. It was down in Listowel. And for those people who've never been to Listowel, the Listowel Writers' Week is the greatest literary festival in Ireland. It is immense crack. It's all down in Listowel over the space of a week. I'm usually there for like 4 or 5 days. I think I did 9 interviews over the space of 5 days last year, and it was just immense fun. And it was around the time that Liverpool were playing the Champions League final as well. I kid you not, I spent Champions League final night in a pub in Listowel with Douglas Kennedy watching Liverpool play. And the two of us had a bottle of red wine in front of us, because who knew? He was a Liverpool fan as well. And then I ran back up the length of the town to do a late night gig that we were doing. I'd organized a series of late night panel gigs, kind of like Nighthawks, where just people came in and talked about utter nonsense. And you'd have the most random groups of people who were on the panels. But Graham, the first year, was in they'd sold so many tickets they hadn't got an appropriate space in the stall for it. So they took the local basketball hall and just piled it full of seats. And you're right, your first thought when you're interviewing somebody like Graham Norton is, Graham Norton interviews people for a living. He's going to sniff you out in a heartbeat. Yet, Graham Norton and those people who I have interviewed who are professional interviewers themselves, they're usually the best, because they know what you want from them. And they understand that if they were interviewing somebody, they would want that person to talk, and they would want that person to be warm and gregarious, and to be nice and to be lovely. And I've interviewed him 4 times publicly at this stage, and he plays to an audience. Seeing him play in front of an audience is like watching somebody, you know, play an orchestra full of people who love Graham Norton, which is a really bad analogy, and I'm going to remove that one right there. It's gone. Edit that out. We're done here. But yeah. So for him, it was both terrifying and at the same time, you know, you were in the hands of somebody who knew exactly what they were supposed to be as a guest.
Yeah, but I think I mean, from being at events you've hosted and from kind of listening to you on the radio and from sitting, I think there's, and it's of all the best interviewers. I mean, you mentioned Parkinson earlier on. I'm not sure whether he said it, but some of that ilk was asked what the best tip is for an interviewer, and I said just be quiet. And because celebrities or stars will not allow dead air, they will fill it. And that's where you get them to reveal stuff. Do you know what I mean? It's kind of just, and I think it's fascinating watching the masters and, you know, watching now people that just be quiet, you know, and that's.
But think about it, the amount of times where even you've been listening to somebody interview someone on the radio and I've done it. I yell at the car radio. I go, stop talking. Just let them. I want to hear whoever it is you're interviewing. They're about to say something really interesting. Don't interject. Just let them say it. And if it was Parkinson, then the man was entirely right. If anybody is ever looking for a tip as an interviewer, let your interview guest talk and don't be afraid to leave dead air. You're right, because they will find a way of, they're not going to sit there and just stare passively at you if they're a movie star or if they're, you know, a famous author. They're going to want to fill the gap.
Yeah. Can you talk to me then about the Facebook and the book club? Like, I mean, talk about exponential growth, Rick.
Yeah. It was originally a hobby. Originally, it was that same first year that I started doing book stuff, and I started talking about books a lot. And people had asked me, you know, would you not consider setting up a book club? And I'm like, I don't really like people that much. I'd rather not. That's okay. And then I thought, well, let's do it online, and we'll do it somewhere. And a Facebook group seemed to work because then it meant other people could kind of take ownership of it as well. I could have set up something like Reese Witherspoon on Instagram, and you put up a picture of a book and you go, I love this book. Everybody buy this book. No one's going to pay attention to me if I do that. If you set up a Facebook group, I'd originally thought I'd be in there about once a month. I'll stick up a book of the month and then let people do as they will. And it's the way it's worked out. It's about 35,000 people in there now. And there's an enormous number of those are active people every month. I think it's about 29,000 of them are active every month. And they talk about everything, about brand new books that they've read, about stuff that they've just found, things they bought in secondhand bookshops, looking for recommendations for a 16-year-old daughter who hasn't read in ages and wants to read now. And my part in it is just more, I twiddle it every now and then. You know, I'm not part of that show either. Weirdly, I mean, the interviewer analogy works quite well here, because I let them off to do all of the things that they want to do. And every now and then, if I think something needs a nudge, I'll just give it a little nudge. But, you know, 99% of all of the posts that occur in there and all the comments have nothing to do with me. I'm just the facilitator.
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating though as well that, you know, there's so many people, you know, that you're aware of that are actually actively involved in something that you've made. You know, that's a thing that couldn't have happened, say, 10 years ago or 15 years ago. You know, that's kind of.
But I think there was always a want for it. And the one thing I found out from talking to people afterwards was, and huge numbers of the people who are part of the book club are people who aren't in real life book clubs, either because they don't have enough friends who read regularly that they'd want to spend any time with, or they're geographically remote from other people. They live in parts of Ireland where it's not necessarily the easiest thing to, and obviously this plays in really well into where COVID is right now, because all of these people can continue to meet up with each other and have their book club in the space of this one little spot on Facebook.
Yeah, and it's also as well, you know, you kind of look at, you're interviewing and you look at kind of the book club, and you look at your work with Sinead and Eason's, and then the program. But I think and then obviously the delivery festivals. But even the authors you kind of mentioned, I think what's fantastic about your work is your ability to live in those different spaces. And I mean that even, and particularly in relation to, say, literary or, you know, the arts field, is that you can live across what's viewed as high art, low art, middle art. It doesn't matter. And that's such a refreshing approach, and a difficult approach. And, you know, that's there are difficult bridges to kind of stand on sometimes. But
I think, again, because I'm not the sort of person who comes at this from a high art background. I'm a punter. I know what I like. I know what movies I like. I know what theater I like. I am the sort of person, though, who back in the day, you know, I'd go over to London for the weekend and I'd go and see a couple of shows, but I'd also, you know, go and see exhibitions that are on in Tate Modern. I'd go and see, you know, bits and pieces anytime, any city I'm ever in, I find myself in art galleries. And okay, I haven't found a way of turning that into something just yet, but, you know, I do talk about it online if I'm ever anywhere, like I've been doing that recently. But it's one of the things I miss most is being in foreign cities and walking into a modern art gallery that I've never been in before and just going, what have you got for me? Show me this.
Yeah.
And I suppose because it's not a job, That's how I can afford to go, this is what I love on Netflix. Here's a book I really love. Have you ever seen the work of, this particular artist? Because it's not my job, it's just my hobby. And these are just a bunch of things that I like all at the same time. Whereas I suppose maybe if it was my job, I might have to think more seriously about it.
Yeah, but there is space in your life where jobs and hobbies are kind of, at the interface of each other.
There's a lot of that.
Yeah. And the Eason's Book Club then, which I mean that's grown huge, and the interest in that over the years has exploded too.
That's mental. Yeah, I know. They came along, look, and I knew the people in Eason's, and they're lovely people and they're really nice. And I got an email one day saying, look, we're thinking of setting up this thing. Would you be interested in doing it? And I said, okay, who's the other person? And they said, well, we've approached Sinead Moriarty. And I knew Sinead a little. Like, Sinead and I would have met at stuff. I didn't know her overly well. And Sinead and I had a bit of a back channel conversation. We went, do you think we can do this? She was like, yeah, I think we can do this. But do you think, should we give it a go? And for the first year, we were kind of quite walking on eggshells. I mean, one of the things we insisted on at the beginning was that, books weren't handed to us to choose. The idea of doing this for them is that we get very, very long lists of potential things that we could potentially choose. And even then we add in our own stuff into those lists and go, is this eligible? Can we do this one? Is this one maybe a possibility? And then we kind of hone it and hone it and hone it to the stage where we're at the end of the third year. Now, I think at this stage, this winter list that's just gone out is the end of the third year. And I like to think that we've pushed the barriers a little bit on it as well, because it's not necessarily what you'd expect from something like this. Like in the current one that I've done, I've recommended Sinead Gleason's Art of the Glimpse, her anthology of Irish short stories, which is like 780 odd pages long. And, so it's not the sort of thing you traditionally find in a bookstore, book club kind of thing. And they've just told us recently as well that, we're doing it for another year. So we'll be back in 2021 doing another series of them across the year. And it is. And it's weird, but it's just another way of doing the same thing, which is finding books that you like, pointing at them and going, you might like that. And whether I do that online or I do that on the book show or I do it, in an Eason's shop with a sticker that points towards this thing.
Yeah.
They're just all extensions of the same thing, really.
And then more recently, during the COVID situation that we find ourselves in and out of again, shelf analysis, which, really interestingly, the way it's kind of grown, and some amazing people you've been speaking to.
Yeah, I know.
And it's really interesting. Having done this for the last while, it's kind of weird because you kind of, it's even though it's not going out live, it's kind of, it's not edited or unless the internet goes, but it's also the fact of that there's an intimacy about Zoom or about whatever, Skype, or about that you're in someone's house or part of their house or their office, and I think also that in this COVID time has been a great leveler in relation to the kind of perceived hierarchies in the arts world. So yeah, talk to me about that, Rick, and how that kind of started and developed for you.
My problem is I can't say no to anything. And this was a question I asked myself. No one even asked me to do it. I asked myself if this was a good idea. I have an inability to say no to things, particularly if they're interesting looking, or they might be fun, or if they could turn out to be quite cool. And at the beginning of all of this, I had that moment of going, probably every public event I'm going to do this year is gone. So I'm not going to get to talk to anybody throughout the course of the year. I think at that stage, I wasn't sure if the book show was coming back in the second half of 2020 either. There was a question that we might not be able to physically engineer it to make it later in the year, because that's a complicated process as well. And I knew I'd be driven spare if I didn't get to talk to people about their work. The other thing was that I knew that there were authors who were bringing out books that were coming out either in that very early part of COVID before everything was cancelled, or that had stuff that had just come out, and they would also be robbed of the ability to go and talk in front of audiences at festivals about their work. And to be honest with you, I've never thought of doing any of this nonsense until I started seeing like TV chat shows. The Late Late were interviewing people on Skype, and I went, well, if it's good enough for them, it's probably good enough for me. I mean, it's not going to look cheap, is it? It's probably going to look okay. And I looked through a couple of online platforms that I like the look of. And admittedly, after the first, I think 7 or 8 or 9 of them, I bought myself a proper webcam, which is the only reason that I look like a semi-serious human being now. The previous one was a bit dodge. But a load of people just said yes. And because you know a load of people over the years, and because you've met them over time and you've interviewed them and you have their email addresses, and you can go in March, April, and May, everyone was in the same boat. So people all kind of went, yeah, okay, sure, yeah, I'll do that. And you get all the people you kind of know, and a lot of really great Irish authors agreed to do it. And then you start going, I wonder who else I can get. And you start floating ideas. And then you tweet like Ian Rankin. And Ian Rankin was like, yeah, that sounds like fun. And so I went, okay, I've got Ian Rankin. And I got like Val McDermid. And I got, I got Janine Commons to talk about American Dirt from the deck of her house just outside of New York City with planes going overhead. And then you start thinking, how much can I push? How far do I keep? And like, I interviewed Neil Gaiman 2 weeks ago, just the day after his 60th birthday. And he's on the Isle of Skye off Scotland. And I'm thinking, these are people I might probably never get to interview in the real world at festivals, unless all the stars align. And unless, because, when you're hired to do a festival, you don't get to go, I will have this person. You're offered, to interview this person or this person. And chances are you're probably not going to get to interview the people you really want to. So instead, what do you do? Create something in which you get to do those things. And because I give them the variation on it, and I think it's the important one, is that the whole purpose of the program is people get to talk about books they love. So they talk a little bit about their current book, maybe for 3 or 4 minutes.
Yeah.
And we have a bit of a chat about what, this year has been like and how it's treated them. But then you go, where's your pile of books? Tell me about the things that you love in your life. And authors are relatively rarely given the opportunity to talk about books that they're passionate about, despite the fact that they're authors, they're passionate about other people's books. So I think for a lot of people, that's been okay, I'll definitely do that because that sounds a bit interesting and a bit different. And then it develops a crucial mass of its own, because like anything else, you start doing 10 episodes or 20 episodes or 30 episodes, and you get a few big names, and you get the Graham Nortons and Val McDermids of this world. And you get people like I interviewed John Irving from his apartment in Toronto. Why did that happen? He said yes, apparently. So once you start nudging those things out and you start having fun with it, it becomes like the raison d'etre. And you never talked about this before. You pressed the big record button. The raison d'etre for this program and for mine, it kind of was all set in the initial early part of COVID, but they're kind of too much fun to not do, at least until they stop being fun for either of us, because there's no point in continuing to put yourself through what is ultimately another job that you're not being paid for and you're not really getting anything for other than the buzz of doing what it is you're doing and the fact that you feel the passion about it. So that's how it came about. I've never done TV. I've done very, very small, limited amounts of TV years ago. But here I am once a week, live from the spare bedroom upstairs. And it is live, because we've screwed up on more than one occasion and lost people and links have gone down. I like the liveness of it. I like the scatty, who knows what's going to happen right now-ness of it. And so again, I foolishly upped my ante and said, I'm going to run a whole festival over Christmas. So between 14th, 15th, and 16th and 17th of December, I have 4 events, 4 nights, live at 8 o'clock every night. There's going to be a poetry event. There's going to be a Books of 2020 panel. One of them is a book quiz, and then one of them is what would have been the Ricochet Book Club Christmas party, because we meet every year and have an actual physical, real-world Christmas party. We did it last year in downstairs in Easton's in Dublin. There was like 150 people showed up to it. So none of us are going to get to meet this year at an event like that. So instead, let's do it online. And I've asked 10 people to take part in those events, and everyone said yes. And so I'm like, okay, well then, all right, it's happening. There you go. I have graphics made up and everything. It's all going to happen. But why? It's insanity. I could just sit around and do nothing. I can't.
It's fascinating though, because the trajectory you're talking about there could as well be applied to this, and it's fascinating though, because you end up the nosing thing, or just kind of going, because similarly the first month or so of this was people that I knew well, or kind of, and then I kind of, it still is somewhat, but then it has spread out a lot. And then you have bizarre ones like where I asked an agent for somebody, and then I looked up them and I said, Jesus, he used to be the manager of Nirvana. So I asked him, and he went, oh yeah, grand. You kind of go, okay. So then if you find yourself talking to this guy who was at Woodstock, you kind of go, it's raining, I'm in Ballymun, he's in his office in Manhattan.
Mm-hmm.
How the hell did we get here? But you know what it is, what's been fascinating for me is that, and it's kind of similar to what you said, most of these are very like this. It's not an interview in a transactional space. To me, yes, some people talk about what they're in at the moment or what's coming up, but it's actually just talking to people about what they do and what they're into. And again, people in the arts, and particularly kind of, as you go up the ladder, don't really get that opportunity. They're always at junkets or selling the book, or unless they meet the right interviewer who's willing to kind of go off piste a bit, they're kind of, it's formulaic. And I think
I think you're 1,000% right. You hit the nail on the head there, in that because things like this don't happen, you're right, in a transactional space. This is not part of a junket. It's not part of a press tour. An awful lot of the people I talk to don't have a new book coming out, or maybe they had a book out early in the year, but they're not really talking about it right now, or they don't want to. So, ultimately, when I ask them, tell me a little bit about the most recent book, I'm just being polite. That's me being polite to them, going, you get a chance to mention the book, but let's talk about what we're really here for. And then you're right, you don't know where you're going to end up. Like last night, the live show last night was Frank Cotterill Boyce. Frank, people will know him as being the screenwriter of things like 24-Hour Party People and A Cock and Bull Story, but he's a children's author as well. And Frank is sitting in his dad's house somewhere in Liverpool. He's wearing a moustache that he apologizes for because he's doing Movember. And we had the most amazing conversation about growing up in Liverpool and about the books that he'd found in his dad's house, some of which he was showing to me. And then at the end, he throws in this, something from Naples. Yeah, I saw Diego Maradona play there, blah, blah, blah. And I went, okay, can we scroll back? Because yesterday, Diego Maradona passed away. And it turns out Frank was in Naples and in the stadium the night that Diego Maradona and Napoli won Serie A. So he was not only there, he then told the whole story of attempting to get back into the city and how jammed the streets were, and all of the mopeds with these incredibly coiffed lads who looked like they were all carrying, secret knives somewhere, and that, you wouldn't mess with them, but they were all at these, immense and they were hopping off everybody's mopeds onto other mopeds, and people then started just driving on the wrong side of the road because the other side of the road was empty and everybody wanted to get back into the city. And then you're sitting there at the end of an interview like that going, how did we get here again? How did this all? But it's a brilliant moment. And afterwards, he dropped me an email and he said, "That's amazing. Thanks for talking about that, because nobody would ever have a conversation with me about something like that." And I think that's where sometimes things like this can lead.
Yeah. Well, look, I'm going to lead it to the end.
Seems fair.
Thank you very, very much for taking part in this. And it's been an absolute joy to chat to you. And I mean, for those that haven't, I'll put all the links down in the in the box on YouTube. I think, do have a look at your series with authors, because the conversations are amazing, and you're an absolute joy to listen to, joy to chat to, and you're not a bad person either. So it's good to have.
That's right.
Rick, thanks a million.
And can I just before I finish, because I'm conscious obviously of the world that you operate in, and I am that person who would do anything I would kill to be in a room with a bunch of other people, watching people perform on a stage, doing anything. I don't care what it is. I just want to see it happen in real life. And that I'm aware, because I've friends who are part of the sphere that you operate in as well. Yeah. And this is the most impossible situation that people had no sense of any of us would ever end up in. And, there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and it's not an oncoming train. And that while it won't happen immediately or right now, there will be people who will flood back to live arts of every shape and color and creed the moment that those things are back and available. And there will be audiences, and they will kill to get to see whatever it is people are writing right now and whatever it is people are putting together right now. And I know that it might not always seem like that, and it's an impossible situation to be in, but I'm one of those people. I am that audience, and I will be there.
No, I think you're right, because I think there's kind of, there's a big fear at the beginning of lockdown about, oh God, if they start doing stuff online, it'll ruin. And I was always of the kind of, no, because people don't understand. They'll understand this is about keeping the kettle on the boil. You know what I mean? Yeah. It's about kind of, it's not turning the lights out, because that's dangerous. But it's about keeping that flame going for a while. But I would agree. I think it might take a while in that kind of interim space. People are kind of not sure about whether it's gone or not. Is it gone? But I think eventually, I think we can all come back better than ever, actually, in a more collaborative way, hopefully.
Yeah, fingers crossed. Don't despair.
Thanks a million.
Pleasure.